Welcome to Faculty Voices. Dr. Marcela del Carmen is the president of Massachusetts General Physicians Organization and executive vice president of Mass General Brigham. She is professor of obstetrics, gynecology, and reproductive biology at Harvard Medical School. And she's also an immigrant from Nicaragua. We're talking to her today in the context of Hispanic Heritage Month. Welcome, Marcela.
Thank you, June, and thank you for inviting me and for this great opportunity to be able to have a conversation with you and your audience. Thank you.
You have a very interesting life story. Could you tell us a little bit about the circumstances in which you came to the United States?
Sure, June. So as you mentioned earlier, I was born in Nicaragua and raised in Nicaragua until the age of 10. So in 1979, my family, specifically my mom and dad, and I have two brothers, an older brother and a younger brother, fled Nicaragua at the very end of the Civil War, right before Anastasio Somoza was overthrown from power. And we came to the United States. My father's an architect, and we were very lucky. He was able to find work as an architect with a friend, a colleague of his who's also an architect in Seattle. So that's kind of our journey. Our journey began that way, and I came to the US when I was 10.
Great. And how did you get interested in medicine?
That's a great story, I think, June. I feel like I'm very lucky. I love being a doctor, June. I've loved being a doctor every day of my life that I've been able to practice medicine. But my first exposure to medicine was in Nicaragua through my grandfather. My mom's father was a physician. He was a urologist. And he had trained at Hopkins back in the 40s. And as a young kid, I remember running errands with him in my hometown in Jinotepe. And he would be completely transformed anytime that he ran into a patient or a family member of a patient that he had cared for. And at the age, I would imagine I was 5 or 6 at that time. And he seemed to me more like a very grumpy older man. And then there was a transformation that occurred every time he came into contact with the patient. And I thought, whatever he does, I want to do, because that's pretty powerful. So he was my first connection to medicine. He loved being a doctor. And I think he sort of irradiated that joy and meaning that he found in medicine. And so from a very early age, in fact, my mom says she doesn't remember my ever saying anything other than I wanted to go to medical school. I wanted to be a physician, and I feel incredibly privileged and lucky that I've found this calling.
Well, that's really interesting. But how do you get interested in gynecological oncology as a specialty?
So that also is a connection to Nicaragua. So I started medical school at Hopkins and was very differentiated. I didn't really know what specialty medicine I would pursue. And in fact, I remember that when I was going through my clinical rotations, everything I did, I loved. So if I was doing psychiatry, I wanted to be a psychiatrist. If I was doing internal medicine, I wanted to do internal medicine. And then in April of my first year, so right around almost the end of my first year of medical school, Claudia Chamorro, Violeta Chamorro's daughter, and as you know, Mrs. Chamorro served Nicaragua as president, came to Hopkins with her son, Marcos, who was diagnosed with leukemia. And I had the privilege of being able to be part of his journey as a cancer patient at Hopkins, and became very interested in oncology, in the field of oncology. I think I saw some very powerful, relationships develop between him and his care team, but also between his mother and the rest of his family and the clinicians at Hopkins who took care of him. And then, as I began to do more rotations and did surgery, when I first walked into an operating room, it was actually a C-section. And I remember feeling like it was a transformational moment in my life, that whatever I did as a doctor, I wanted it to be somehow related to surgery. And so I think it was a combination of wanting to be a surgeon, but also wanting to care for patients with cancer, which was informed by my experience with Marcos, that ultimately informed my choice to become a GYN oncologist. My training has been in the management of women with gynecological cancers, and I provide care for them surgically and also what we call systemically, so chemotherapy, targeted therapies. And so I have the privilege of caring for patients at a time in their life that they feel very vulnerable. And one of the unique things about my specialty is that we provide continuity of care. It's not like we just do the surgery. We actually are able to provide care along a continuum or a journey of cancer treatment. And it's an incredible privilege. As much as I like to operate, I think that there is something very, very unique about being somebody's doctor long term. especially at the time of a cancer diagnosis.
Well, thank you. But how has the immigration experience formed your sense of identity in the way that you perform as a doctor?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I can tell you that as I've gotten older, I actually have a different answer. It's definitely, I think, defined my identity more than informed it. I consider myself from Nicaragua. I was born and raised in Nicaragua, and I come from a family where my parents were very focused and intentional in making sure that my brothers and I grew up with a sense of pride. I feel very proud of my roots, but obviously I've spent 44 years of my 54 years in the United States. And so I also feel American and very grateful to this country for the opportunities that I've had to become educated, to go to medical school and train as a physician, and to be part of American academic medicine. But I would say, it's been an incredible privilege for me to have this shared identity, you know what I mean? And to be able to draw from each of those parts from two different worlds, right? I mean, I draw from those two experiences all the time, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes one at the exclusion of the other. I think it's a richness of experiences because you're able to draw from one culture and sort of see your life through that lens. But then at the same time, you can appreciate something through a very diverse experience because you understand that alternative way of functioning or living. Let me give you a concrete example. I think the language piece is critical for me. I read both, obviously medical journals in English, but I read non-medical literature, for example, in English and in Spanish. And to be able to read Garcia Marquez or Gioconda Belli, one of our very own Nicaraguan poets and novelists, in my native tongue, it's just incredible, right? Because it means something different when you're reading something like that in your native language. And so I think for me, it's informed who I am today. And, there are times in your growing up where it's a little more challenging, I think, to not be identified as a member of one culture. And I think for me, especially as a teenager, I grew up in Miami, and Miami facilitated that sort of dynamic of coming of age in the intersection of two cultures, because a lot of the kids that I went to high school with had very similar experiences. So I think that made it so that it wasn't awkward. I know that a lot of young people struggle with having to embrace two cultures and two identities, and they have a tendency to want to embrace the one that they live in and maybe sometimes forego the one where they come from. And I'd encourage people to actually reconsider and realize that it's by embracing both that you actually are able to enjoy just the richness of experience that's only afforded by being able to come from those two different cultures, in my case. I think the other piece that made it easier for me to embrace this duality is my parents. I mean, as I said, they really were so proud of our Nicaraguan background that it was never something that I felt embarrassed about or that I felt I had to move away from. For example, it was important for them that we speak Spanish at home and that we spoke good Spanish. I went to college at Emory and majored in biology and Spanish literature, and the drive to major in Spanish literature was really very much something that my parents encouraged me to do, so that I had formal education in Spanish and I was able to, I had fluency in the language, but certainly that I could read the grade master's in Spanish literature in my native tongue.
You reading anything interesting right now in Spanish?
I am. I'm reading La Otra Isabel, which is the story of the daughter of the last Aztec emperor of Montezuma, and how she manages that transition from being the daughter of the last Aztec emperor and essentially having to become acculturated to Spanish culture because of the colonization of Mexico. It's another great story of dual identities and sort of coming of age in a world that feels chaotic, but at the end you end up, I think, taking the best of each and hoping that that serves you well.
It's very fascinating, this issue of dual identities and how that's a bit different when you're in Miami, where so many different people have this dual identity or know people who have dual identities. But a lot of your career you've spent in places like Seattle, Baltimore, Boston, places that have a substantial Latin community, but not many Nicaraguans.
Yeah.
So how does that change your perceptions as a Nicaraguan woman? Does it fool around with your identity at all?
I think that for me, June, one of the things that people notice about me is that the first thing I say when I introduce myself is my name. And then very quickly after I say I'm from Nicaragua, I think for me it's really important to bring that forward. And I don't know what the psychology behind it is, but I presume that part of it is making sure that people know where I come from. I think it's important for me because no doubt, I think the biggest loss in my life has been loss of country, for sure. On the other hand, over time and distance, the love for Nicaragua in me is very deep. I like to say that I have Nicaragua tattooed in my soul. If you came to my office, you'll see that most of the things hanging on the wall are pictures from Nicaragua. I love sort of feeling that closeness to my home country. I think what was hard was the time that I started to realize that for some members of our community, being different or being of a different race and ethnicity becomes a subtraction. And I never thought of it that way. I never thought of myself as being less than another person because of where I came from. In fact, I felt that we more of an addition, right? That I brought this other heritage and this other culture into the communities that I came in contact with. And it was as a young doctor, just out of training on the faculty here at Mass General, where I started experiencing racism, I would say from the source of racism that is the most hurtful to me because it's from patients, right? I feel like I can handle discrimination from any other space in my life, but when it comes from a patient where my commitment, my life vocation has been to care for women with cancer, it's pretty devastating to actually have a patient either intimate or in some way communicate to you that they're not exactly comfortable with you being their physician because of your accent or your race or your ethnicity. And that's something that for me at the beginning was paralyzing. I just didn't know how to handle it. I can tell you that even in those early moments in my career, I never felt any sense of shame or anything other than incredible pride for being from that part of the world. I think as I've gotten older, it happens less because I have now a lot of gray hair, and I think I don't have to struggle with being a young surgeon in practice. So that I think has helped a lot. And I think I've also matured in my ability to actually ask patients to tell me more about why they have a sense of discomfort. And we talk about it, and it's a moment for me to learn about their perspective as a doctor. The first charge, I think, is to listen to patients. And I obviously would not want to take care of somebody who is uncomfortable. But as you have those conversations, you realize that a lot of what the perceptions that patients in this case may have are actually ill-formed. And that once you start talking like two human beings, you're able to get through all of that and get to a place where the conversation is lighter. Certainly, I would say very honest and transparent. For me as an oncologist, I cannot afford to take care of somebody who doesn't trust me or thinks that they're going to have better care if they have a man or a white person take care of them. But, I'll share with you and your audience an anecdote. When I was a young attending, I was on call for the weekend, and we had a patient coming in with a pelvic mass through the emergency department, and I was the doctor on call for the weekend. So the patient was admitted by one of our fellows, and I went up to the floor to meet the patient and introduce myself and let her know the course of care. I walked into the room, I was wearing scrubs and a surgical cap, and the patient was on the phone, and then sitting next to her was her husband, who was in a reclining chair. And as soon as I walked in, I hadn't said anything. He just looked at me and he said, "Do you mind coming back later because I have to clean the room because we're waiting to meet the surgeon?" And I'm pretty quick with words, but I thought, what, I can't react in the moment because I just really wasn't sure what to do. And so I went back to the operating room to do the next case, came back later in the day, and I introduced myself and I say, this is going to be awkward for you both, and it's going to be awkward for me, but I'm the doctor on call over the weekend, and there's no one around other than me to take care of you. And they were both incredibly apologetic. I think they felt terrible. But I think that we have to be conscious as a society that we can sometimes say things that assume something about the other person, and we hear things that assume an experience that may not be what that other person is trying to transmit. So we have to be very careful about how we process these experiences. And I think at the end of the day, be willing to give people the benefit of the doubt.
I think you were quite courageous to handle it in that way. But of course, part of the problem is that people aren't used to seeing women and people of color in those roles.
Right.
How would you rank diversity in medicine these days? Can you give us thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's better than when I came into medicine 30 years ago. I think that we've made some roadways. For example, when you look at entry enrollment into medical schools, most medical schools have very good programs that have led to a more diversified class where, now in some medical schools, including our own at Harvard, the majority, if not maybe a little bit over the majority, are women. We tend to recruit just incredible talent from underrepresented in medicine groups. So I think we do well sort of at the entry level. I think what's harder is when you start looking at positions of leadership. So chairs of department, deans at medical schools, so more of the presidents of hospitals, those positions I think tend to be still primarily populated by white people and physicians, and many times by white men. So I think what we need to do is be more intentional about recruiting and retaining faculty and creating a journey of career development that really is an investment into their future and empower these young physicians to really have the training and the tools to become leaders in medicine. I think it's not a pipeline problem. I think it's more, what do you do with that pipeline and making sure that, again, we make an intentional commitment to their academic career development.
You talk about recruitment. Do you think the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action is going to have an impact on diversity in medical schools?
I hope not. I hope that, at a time in our history where we are making some inroad into creating a more diversified medical experience for our patients. And I want to highlight the fact that I believe diversity and inclusion is important in all sectors of our society. But in medicine, it's mission critical because, for example, in the United States, as you know, we're becoming a much more diversified country. We need doctors for whom our patients can recognize themselves in. As we, for example, continue to innovate, let's say in cancer, in the development of new cancer drugs, we need to accrue patients of color to these clinical trials. And accrual to clinical trials, as you know, for people of color is very low. We're not going to get there unless we have a diversified workforce caring for these patients. I think it's mission critical in medicine above and beyond any other sectors in our society. I hope that the ruling of the Supreme Court does not actually cause any deterrent of our continued traction and journey moving forward. I'm hoping that we continue to find and explore ways to recruit doctors of color to come to medicine and also to stay in academic medicine. It is mission critical more than ever. I think we'll have to look for creative ways to be able to create that experience, moving forward.
Creative ways, what sort of things do you have in mind?
For example, when you interview a medical student, you're like, we're not going to be able to go through applications and decide based on the name of the student or where they grew up or what college they went to or their family income, if they meet some of these areas of need that would define them as being underrepresented in medicine. For example, we know that Latinos and Blacks are significantly underrepresented in medicine, Native Americans as well. And if we can look at the race and ethnicity box to identify that, then I think we have to make the ask. We have to talk about distance travel, like how hard is it for an individual to actually get to the doorstep at Harvard Medical School, right? Is this somebody that came from an experience of an immigrant family? And those things I think are going to come across or maybe come out in conversation. We need to continue to engage in the recruitment of a diversified community. That's what makes Harvard, I think, great, is the fact that we're a great place for those doctors and students to come because we're very welcoming of people from all different walks of life. If they leave this community much richer because of who they are and what they brought to that experience. So I think that we'll have to engage with more energy to try to elicit that diversity of lived life and lived experience that will continue to empower our journey to become even more diversified than we are today.
Many immigrants now, especially from Venezuela, Cuba, and I imagine Nicaragua, have been doctors and nurses in their own countries. And some of them are working as janitors and house cleaners, despite the current shortage of medical workers in the United States. Do you advocate fast tracking for the licenses? If so, what would that look like? What do you think is a path for integrating these talented people into our society?
I got to tell you, I have the privilege in my job to travel all over the world and to actually meet doctors from Latin America, from Asia, who are incredible clinicians, great teachers, and also researchers. So we need to be more open in the United States to allowing those physicians who are coming from their native countries and practice medicine here. There's got to be some regulation because we have to meet certain standards, right? I mean, we've got to be able to measure that they have the competencies that we have in our own medical training. I don't know a lot about the credentialing of physicians, for example, coming from different countries in other countries. But I suspect that there are industry standards. Like if I were to decide tomorrow that I'm going to go practice in Chile or Mexico, I'm sure that there's a path forward, right? I would have to sit for an exam, or I don't know what the protocol would be, but we can create protocols the way that we have them for doctors who are trained in the United States. You know what I mean? That they, pass boards and become board certified and are able to practice medicine. I think what you said a few minutes ago is so true. We are seeing an incredible shortage of doctors. And we had forecasted that shortage before the pandemic. The pandemic, I think, actually will make that forecast even worse because so many doctors in the United States, I think also globally, have rates of burnout and they're leaving medicine early. So they're retiring early. They are either leaving medicine altogether or taking non-clinical jobs. And so I think that shortage may actually come sooner than we think, and it may actually be greater in terms of its impact than we had conceived before the pandemic. So I do think that being open and creative about ways that we can allow, a good credentialing process to take place so these physicians who are here can practice medicine.
Thank you. You've also said that you're very interested in leveling inequality in cancer care. Could you explain to us what those disparities are and what you think can be done about them?
Thank you for that question. So, disparities in medicine exist across the spectrum of care. And so in cancer, for example, let's say you have a cancer for which you can be screened. Let's pick cervical cancer. So you have an opportunity to actually have early detection of that cancer, potentially even prevent it if you get vaccinated against HPV using the HPV vaccine. That's an entry point into care. The second one would be having pap smears on the cadence that's suggested so that you actually have the pre-cancer condition diagnosed before it becomes a cancer. And then once you have cancer, are you accessing the healthcare systems that have the expertise, both with regards to the clinicians and the treatments, where you're going to have the optimal treatment recommended to you? And then are you bound by social determinants of health that are going to make it hard for you to adhere to those protocols? Do you have problems with transportation, legal status, food security, housing security, insurance, education, all these things that are so connected to being able to receive good health care. And then if your cancer returns, you're coming back into care, are those social determinants of health that made it hard for you to even get screened or get the HPV vaccine going to continue to play a role in your ability to gain access to cutting edge treatment in the recurrent setting? And then we see it all the way to who has access to hospice and what does those hospice resources look like if you are somebody who's actually coming to a different part of your care, primarily end of life care. So I think that if I were to sort of explain it, it's the intersection between healthcare as an industry, the patient, and the clinical team. And each of those circles has to basically come together almost like in a Venn diagram. And at each point of care, all of the social determinants of health that I just listed really play a role in how a patient is able to get through their care experience. So we know, for example, that in GYN cancers, outcomes are worse. For example, in endometrial cancer, if you correct for stage of cancer, survival is worse for Black women. And it is because of all the things that I've mentioned that play a role in how women are treated and ultimately how long they live. As we innovate, and we are at a very exciting time in cancer drug development, we have targeted therapies, we have immuno-oncology drugs. There's an incredible pipeline of new therapeutics, new surgical techniques that are coming into play literally today. The problem that we have is that if we're not incorporating our patients that are underserved into the clinical trials that are evaluating the efficacy and the safety of those drugs, for example, in the general population, we're not going to know whether there's benefit or not in the patients that actually need it the most. And I think we potentially risk making that gap wider. So there's a lot of things that we can do, I think, to close the gap. I think one is to have a more diverse workforce. And then I think as a society, we've adjudicated all these responsibilities of the social determinants of health to medicine. But really, medicine, coming out of the pandemic, most academic medical centers are facing incredible financial challenges, and it's not affordable in the healthcare system for the healthcare system to attend to education, food insecurity, like all the things that are drivers of inequity. As physicians and as the healthcare industry have to manage some of them, but we can't do it alone. I think that it also intersects with public health and policy. And I think the political climate in this country is very complicated. But I think there's a social justice imperative, is the best way that I would describe it, to really tend to the social determinants of health that have been overlooked for so many centuries in this country that I don't think we can keep looking the other way anymore.
Looking at Latinos as a community, how bad is the situation in terms of social determinants?
I think it's pretty bad because it starts with the fact that many of our Latino patients don't have legal status, so they're afraid to come to the hospital because they're worried they're going to get deported. So we tend to see, in my discipline, women with cancers coming at much later stages because they don't want to come in because they're worried about being deported. They don't have a lot of social support. Many of them are alone. Their families are in their home countries. They are working 2 to 3 jobs. So when you tell them you got to come in and have an operation that's going to take you out of your job for 4 weeks or 6 weeks, it breaks your heart, and they can't do it. They'll tell you that they're worried about losing their job. And a lot of times, as you know, these families or these Latinos are sending money to their countries. I mean, they're supporting their children, their parents. And then if you ask them, there's a language barrier that's important. They have to negotiate their care through a translator. Education is also plays a role. Housing security. A lot of times these patients will live in an apartment with several other families. So if they're getting chemotherapy and they're having side effects, it's really hard to manage. I think all of these play out in a very magnified way in our immigrant communities.
One of the ways that which we're seeing disparities in underserved communities is in access to abortion.
Yeah.
In your opinion, what impact does the overturning of Roe versus Wade have on these communities, particularly the Latino community?
I think that once again, we are targeting our most vulnerable population of patients and the ones that have the fewer options, because I suspect that if you have resources, you can get on a plane and go get an abortion in a state where you're going to get a safe abortion performed. But in a lot of the states where the law has changed and abortion is no longer legal, I worry that in those states, a high percentage of citizens are underrepresented minorities. And a lot of these women don't have access to contraception. We know that it's tied to access to education. And so I worry that where abortions are no longer legal are places where an illegal abortion is going to be really dangerous in the patients that we've left so far behind already.
And finally, what advice would you give to a young Latina or Latino interested in a career in medicine?
First, I would love to see more Latinos and Latinas think about medicine as a career. I think it is an incredible privilege when somebody allows you to take care of them at a time that their health is basically threatened. And I really mean that it's a sacrosanct charge, and it's a life of service and responsibility. But I've always thought and believe that our patients give us more than we ever give them. I think that it was Mark Twain who said that the 2 most important days in your life are the day you're born and the day that you realize what you're born to do. And for me, I just can't imagine doing anything else in my life where you really are invited to come into somebody's life and family. And at a critical time, in my case, at a time of a cancer diagnosis, and the embrace is incredible. I mean, I can tell you that my life is filled with love and meaning. And I love being a doctor every day since I graduated medical school. And I get a little sad as I get older because I know that at some point I'm going to have to stop taking care of patients, and it'll be a very sad day for me.
I hope that day doesn't come very soon. Thank you very much. You've been listening to Marcela del Carmen. She's president of Massachusetts General Physicians Organization and executive vice president of Mass General Brigham. She's also a professor at Harvard Medical School, and she's a Nicaraguan immigrant. Thank you for doing this podcast in honor of Hispanic Heritage Month.
Thank you, Juna. Thank you again for the privilege and the opportunity to spend this time with you and your audience. Thank you so much.